Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Good afternoon to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. My name is Murray Bruges. I'm the director of the Helen Clark Foundation Mahi Arongo. Thank you for joining us today for a webinar exploring the 2024 US presidential elections and their potential global implications with guests Ambassador Derek Shearer and Bruce Stokes. As always, a very warm welcome to our Helen Clark Foundation members. Our foundation is an evidence-based, independent, non-partisan think tank, and we rely on our members and donors' support to be able to do this work. If you enjoy these sessions but are not currently a member, please do consider joining. Membership is affordably priced at $65 a year waged and $35 unwaged. And by signing up, you're not just helping us to develop long-term solutions to New Zealand's long-term challenges, you're also able to join our foundation's members-only webinars to get advanced copies of new reports and priority entry to our foundation's events. So please do consider joining at Helen Clark, that's all one word, .foundation. Before we begin today's webinar, I'll just quickly note that our foundation has a report on transparency and integrity launching this weekend. So keep an eye out for updates on that in your inboxes, as well as a webinar with the author and international guests in the coming weeks. We'll also be co-hosting a webinar with the New Zealand Initiative on congestion charging, a topic on which you may have seen some announcements by the New Zealand government yesterday. So keep an eye out for that and other webinar announcements in your inbox, and please do feel free to forward these to friends and family. If you're new to our webinars, it's worth noting that this is not a normal Zoom call. Your cameras and microphones are off, so there's no risk anyone can see or hear you eating your lunch. We'd love for you to participate in this webinar, however, and the best way to do so is to submit questions for our panelists as they occur to you by typing them into Zoom's Q&A function, which you can access at the bottom of your screen. You can also upvote other people's questions by clicking on the thumbs up button. At around the 40-minute mark, we'll put those questions to our panelists. You'll see there is a separate chat function below. We might use that to put relevant links during the webinar, but please put any questions for the panelists in the Q&A function. Finally, we're always looking to improve our webinars, so we'd love to hear your views on today's session. You should see a feedback prompt in your browser at the end of this webinar, or receive a form via email the next day or so. The form takes about 2 minutes to complete, and your views are very helpful for us when we're designing future webinars. So that's it for housekeeping. I'll now hand over to our foundation's patron, the Right Honourable Helen Clark, to introduce our guests and facilitate today's webinar. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Murray, and thank you for all the work you've done to bring these two incredible guests to our Kiwi audience. I just saw on the first question that came in, are the presentations up to date? Because a lot's happened in the US in the last month. And I can assure everyone listening that having just spoken with both our guests, what they have to say is totally up to date, up to the minute, I think we could say. So our two guests, Ambassador Derek Shearer, who's Chevalier Professor of Diplomacy and World Affairs at Occidental College in Los Angeles. Derek is a veteran of the Clinton administration. He's served as an advisor on presidential campaigns. Bruce is visiting senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. He's co-authored a work on Ukraine and on transatlantic trends recently, and has also been noted in the past as one of the US's most influential China watchers. Bruce also tells me that he had a great-grandfather who was a missionary in New Zealand. So it shows we're all 2 to 3 degrees connected away from each other. So fantastic to have you both here. And I'm going to swing in now to our questions. And the first one is just really an information one, because while we tend to have very well-informed audiences on the webinars, the truth is that the US presidential election is a very different beast from a New Zealand parliamentary election. So, Derek, I was going to throw to you first just for a quick primer for our viewers on what the electoral college nature of the contest means for the way people campaign.
Okay, and I'll be brief, Helen, because I'm sure you have a very well-informed audience. But as they probably know, the presidents don't get voted in by the majority of the total voters. It's a state-by-state vote. And there's something called electors who are selected from each state by the winner in that particular state. So what that means in this decentralized system, it has two important, I think, things for everybody to keep in mind. It means that presidential campaigns can ignore certain states. For example, California is going to go Democratic. So you will not see a lot of campaigning or even campaign ads in California. New York will go Democratic, but Florida most likely is going to go Republican. So in a sense, many of the states are already decided. So what happens is that states that are close, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, basically kind of 50-50 states, that's where you're going to see the majority of the campaign conducted. A few others are Arizona, North Carolina, states that have gone either way in the election. So people often ask, why do they talk about how important the Midwest is? Because there are these key states that we don't know whether they're going to vote Republican or Democratic. Now, the other part of this is that we have a decentralized voter registration and conduct of election system. The states register the voters, and the counties in each state actually conduct the elections. Now, you would say that's very democratic and a good idea. But what we saw 4 years ago is that this decentralized system allows for people who don't like the outcome to protest, to try and change the vote in a particular state, to call officials and tell them to find me more votes, or for lawsuits. And I want to just highlight that because I think everyone should be prepared for similar challenges and a kind of chaos that might take place after the next election. We may have the networks telling us who won, but it's going to be contested. It's going to be highly political. I think, Bruce, you'd agree with that if you want to add anything.
Bruce, would you like to just add anything to Derek's answer?
No, I'm fine. That's fine.
Yeah,
that's fine.
So I think New Zealanders will completely get the point about the Electoral College, because it's very much like our first past the post elections used to be, that you could win a majority of vote across the country, but you had to win in key seats. And so just as US candidates will focus on the states where the Electoral College vote will make the difference, so we used to focus on what we call the marginals. And I guess in a way that's also the case with the congressional elections in the US as well. By the way, I should have said it was Derek, not Bruce, who had the great-grandfather who was the missionary in New Zealand. So coming then to Bruce, what about a quick overview of the state of the race as of today? We all know there's polls, and polls. Usually the moving averages tend to be the most interesting. But who's got the momentum at the moment? And looking at major milestones coming up on the way to 5 November, I guess the next biggie would be the Democrat convention, right?
Yes, thank you. And Helen and Murray, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I look forward to the questions that the audience may pose. I think we have to understand that one of the ultimate unfairnesses of the US election is that we get to vote and you have to live with the consequences. And so I think it's terribly important you try to understand what's going on inside the United States. As a backdrop, I think Americans underappreciate this, and certainly foreigners underappreciate that the Americans have lived over the last 50 years through an accelerated pace of change. The society has changed dramatically and much more rapidly than ever before. The percentage of non-white people in the last 50 years has tripled. The percentage of foreign-born people has tripled. The percentage of births outside of marriage have quadrupled. And we've gone from 40% of the workforce being female to 60% of the workforce of women being involved in the workforce. So it is a dramatic change, a very short period of time. It's probably not surprising then, for in 28 of the last 36 years, Americans have said that the country is going in the wrong direction. And it's at a record high right now. And I think we all tend to think, well, it's about the economy. No, it's not just about the economy. It's about people being unsettled by the changes that they have lived through, and they're telling us they're having trouble with that. And a candidate like Donald Trump in 2016, and again in 2020, and now again, is implying that he can take people back to an age when that there wasn't as much change. And by the way, Black people knew their place, and Hispanics and immigrants were here, and women knew their place. They were in the home. I mean, all sorts of things that go back to the 1950s. So that's the backdrop for this election. And what we see is that with the decision by President Biden not to run again, and Vice President Harris to capture the nomination, that a race that Biden was losing in almost every poll by beyond the margin of error. She is now leading in almost every poll, sometimes within the margin of error, sometimes occasionally outside the margin of error, but it is effectively tied at the very least, which is certainly a change. And while people could say, oh, it's only been a 4 or 5 point change in the public opinion, that's a huge change in public opinion in a very short period of time. Very huge, enormous. And more specifically, to Derek's point about there are particular states that matter in our particular, frankly, cockamamie system that was designed in the 18th century, we can't change, is that in the most recent New York Times poll, in 3 of the battleground states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, she is leading Trump by 4 percentage points in each of those states. Now, that's within the margin of error, but she's leading. And people should understand that in the Electoral College system, if, for example, she would lose Pennsylvania, which is the 5th largest state in the country, it would be very, very difficult to make that up in the Electoral College. She has to win all 3 of those states that New York Times has recently polled: Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And she has to pick up some other things, but really Pennsylvania is still the key. And so we're likely to see her and President Biden, who is originally from Pennsylvania, spending an enormous amount of time in my home state, which is Pennsylvania.
Wow. Well, as I foreshadowed earlier, there's been 3 to 4 weeks of just incredible turbulence in the US campaign for reasons we're all familiar with. The debate, the assassination attempt on President Trump, the selection of J.D. Vance, which created a lot of discussion. President Biden's first getting COVID and being out of the limelight and then withdrawing, Kamala Harris coming in. Look, can we expect a roller coaster ride like this for the next 3 months, I think is the question. Do we need to sort of get the popcorn and the Coke for the cheap seats to be watching this for more big surprises?
I do think you're right. I think that there will be a bump that she's likely to get out of the Chicago convention next week for the Democratic Party. Although your viewers should pay attention to what happens in the streets in Chicago. I remember in 1968 there were violent street demonstrations against the Vietnam War, and that really did hurt the Democratic Party. And there will be demonstrations in Chicago. The question is, what do they look like? How do they play out? And I think we know from experience in campaigns, candidates tend to screw up at some point in a 2 or 3 month campaign. And what we don't know about Harris in particular is, can she recover from those screw ups? Because they are inevitable. She'll misspeak, she'll do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing. That just happens with every politician. But the point is, do you have the ability to recover from it? And that's going to be one of the real tests, I think, over the next couple of months.
Bruce,
let me see.
Derek, let me bring you back in just on what we might expect over this period through to 5 November.
Well, first of all, I just think everyone should understand that Kamala Harris did something actually quite extraordinary, which is she seized the moment. Within 10 seconds after President Biden made his announcement, she was on the phone to her rivals, getting their support. So she displayed political leadership almost immediately, which is very important for those people who had some doubts about her as a politician. Secondly, she's presented herself in a kind of joyous manner. She's now famous for her laugh, for smiling, for being a happy warrior, for taking a Democratic Party that frankly was depressed and suddenly making it kind of ebullient and enthusiastic. And then she made a choice for the vice president of Tim Walz, and she picked somebody she's comfortable with. But more than that, what her selection showed was her good judgment. I mean, the thing about vice presidents is that they actually don't decide elections directly. It's not as if voters are going to say, oh, I like Tim Walz better than J.D. Vance, so I'll vote for that ticket. But what it displayed was her smart political judgment. She had a sense of this man, and he has turned out already to be an amazing campaigner, and he has a great backstory, but more importantly, he has this manner, which is friendly and joyous, like we're in this together. And the enthusiasm level in the party, which I've seen firsthand, is through the roof. Fundraisers who were for Biden switched the next day, so they had a smooth transition to the fundraising team. My wife was participant in a Zoom call of white women for Harris. 200,000 people signed up. It crashed Zoom and they had to switch to YouTube. And we keep hearing about this. A friend just sent me a picture of her dog who is already wearing a Harris scarf, which has been produced. So I think she's off to a great start. But as Bruce says, things are going to happen. What we also have to look out for are things in the world. We don't know what's going to happen in the Middle East. The US, unfortunately, can't control Netanyahu or Hamas. And that is linked to student protests back at home, which could be a factor. We have seen already some attempts at hacking into probably both campaigns. We're not sure if it's Iranians. We know in the past the Chinese and the Russians have hacked into our campaigns. So there are going to be exogenous events from outside. And then there's always the weird and unexpected. I mean, Bruce agrees with me on this, that something we can't even make up, probably stranger than we could even imagine Donald Trump saying or doing, will happen during the campaign. And how the candidates respond, and I can give you some examples from the past, makes a great difference.
I think, again, Kiwi audience will be thinking as they listen to both of you about some of the similarities with the 2017 election campaign in New Zealand, where the government had been in power for 9 years. The Labour Party wasn't making any traction, and 7 weeks out, the leader said, I can't do it, and handed over to the deputy, who was Jacinda Ardern, and a kind of Jacinda mania broke out. And she had 7 weeks to the election. Of course, in this case, Kamala Harris has had more like 4 months. There were foo-foos, shall we say, in the campaign, one over tax policy, which saw the vote go down. And in the end, her party didn't poll as highly as the National Party, but it got to form the government anyway because of coalition politics. But that sort of sense of a wave of enthusiasm is very reminiscent of what happened here 7 years ago. And I think one of the most hilarious examples of this I've seen from the States is a video reel on golf carts for Kamala in Florida. So, but as you say, there's these black swan events that we have to look out for. For example, would we have anticipated that Ukraine would invade Russia? How's that going to play out? How will the man in Moscow react to this? As you say, the Middle East has its own horrific dynamic, really. So, anything could come out of left field. I suppose that leads me to ask, to what extent are policy issues going to play a big role in the election? We can come to foreign policy a bit later, but on domestic issues, you have abortion, which the two sides have defined on. You've got immigration, where Kamala Harris was, of course, associated with the border as a delegation from President Biden. You have the Supreme Court issues and so on. I mean, are these issues going to play a key role, or are we looking at more a personality contest between two very different types of candidates and their vision for America?
Right now, it is very much personality driven in the last 3 weeks, because the Harris campaign has not really laid out its policy agenda. It won't differ that much from the Biden agenda. She can't do that. But we have yet to hear what it will be and where it may differ. And Trump has gotten off of message. He had been stressing immigration and the economy. He's now into a politics of grievance. He seems to have taken it personally that Biden's not his counterpart, and his advisors are telling you, you've got to stop complaining and get on with the messaging of the campaign. And he may be able to do that down the road, but his personality is such that it's obviously very hard for him to do that. He cannot seem to get past the fact that he has to run against a woman, and a woman of color. But eventually, my guess is we will get back to a debate about the economy, because the polling is very clear. The public believes the national economy is in bad shape. A majority of Republicans believe that the economy is in recession. It's very far from being in a recession, but they believe that. And people, vote the way they believe. Immigration, as I mentioned, we've had a tripling of the foreign-born population in a 50-year period. We've never, even as a country of immigrants, we've never had a tripling in a 50-year period before of the percentage of the population that's foreign-born. And the last 2 times we reached where we are now, which is about 14% of our population is foreign-born. The last 2 times we reached that point in the 1880s and the 1920s, we had a populist backlash, and we're experiencing a populist backlash now. So that will continue, I think, to be a major issue, which, frankly, if Donald Trump cannot make those the 2 issues again, if he continues on this politics of grievance, then the Harris campaign of, as Derek said, of happiness and joy and future looking, not backward looking, will do her very well.
Yeah, and one of President Biden's problems was he was kind of obsessed with what he had already done and talking about the past, taking credit for the past, when elections are about the future. And in general, people don't want to thank politicians for what they did in the past. They want to know what the future is going to bring. And especially if they're nervous about the future for all the various reasons that Bruce has mentioned. And I think Harris understands that, and she's been very good about talking about the future and what kind of country we want to have in the future, and then how to get there. And so I think she'll be specific about some of her economic proposals, but they're going to be very people-oriented, kind of putting people first, the kinds of things that Governor Walz did in Minnesota. He provided free lunches for all the kids so they could get an equal start. He made sure that there was time off for workers, things that are very tangible and practical, not theoretical. And so she's going to be issuing fairly soon some of these economic specifics. But I think the most important thing is how they're framed in terms of the future. The other thing, as Bruce said, is that Donald Trump cannot stay on message. I mean, he was all for bashing China over TikTok and said we should all shut down and get rid of TikTok. But then one of his big donors is a big investor in TikTok. And now Trump says TikTok's a great thing. He loves TikTok. So he can be all over the map about a lot of these things. And I think that ultimately puts him off message and hurts him in this campaign. J.D. Vance has already caused himself some of his own problems by seeming to attack women who didn't have children, calling them, childless cat women. Well, there are a lot of women by choice who choose not to have kids. They've already formed groups. So what we call unforced errors can also affect the campaign.
Yeah, some really terrific insights there. Certainly looking from abroad, it seems that President Trump was really thrown quite off course by President Biden deciding not to run, because his whole campaign was geared at that, and he's had trouble adjusting. But as you've both implied, that they will eventually get back to the issues, and then we may see some interesting debate. I think the observation also about President Biden being very proud of what he'd done, but not projecting forward. We all know there's no gratitude in politics. People bank what you've done and they want to know what the next thing is. So, both candidates need to be projecting forward, I think. But if we kind of move from that domestic focus to what the election of, on the one hand, President Trump, or on the other hand, a President Harris would mean for the rest of us. What does it mean for NATO? What does it mean for the UN? What does it mean for the Asia Pacific? What does it mean for the World Trade Organization? US-China relationship? Are they going to be offering different visions of that? Or to what extent is that even going to be important in the campaign?
I don't think it'll be that important. American elections have rarely, if ever, turned on international issues. Maybe you could argue in 1968, during the height of the Vietnam War, or possibly in 2004, after the attack on the World Trade Center. But for the most part, Americans voted domestic issues. There's some underlying, I think, concerns that people need to understand. Americans, a majority of Americans believe, and it's a strong majority of Republicans believe, that America is taken advantage of by the rest of the world. We do everything and you do nothing. And that informs a lot of people's views about whether we should support NATO, whether we should support Ukraine, let alone the UN or things like of that nature. I think a key consequence of this election could be policy towards China. Trump has promised to impose an across-the-board 10% tariff on all imports and a 60% tariff on Chinese imports. A lot of people say, oh, well, he would never do that. It'd be really too draconian. even if he did a 30% tariff on Chinese imports, the point is it would push Chinese product into other countries. And I think it would totally disrupt the global economy. And so we have to be very concerned about that. It is true that Biden kept a lot of Trump's tariffs on Chinese products and in fact imposed some constraints of his own on trade with China. But Harris has not spoken out on this, so we don't know exactly where she comes down on this. She is a Californian, so she's probably much more focused on Asia than Biden, who spent most of his career focusing on Europe. I think Harris administration would accelerate the pivot back to Asia by the United States. But I would underscore, I don't think that means much trade liberalization with Asia. That I think I know of no one who seriously believes we can revive American membership in TPP, even though I think it was one of the most important strategic errors or missteps in my lifetime by the United States.
And
Derek?
let me just say that I want to be perfectly clear. You have to remember that President Trump and his party's slogan is America first. And that means he's going to do not only what he thinks best for America, but best for Donald Trump. And he doesn't really care about allies. What he cares about is himself and his relationship to other strong, important people. And this can lead to a very chaotic foreign policy. During his first term, he did have what people call some grown-ups, some more professional people in the government advising him on military and foreign affairs. What he's been saying was they told him he couldn't do things he wanted to do, and that this time around, he's not going to have anybody in the administration who tells him no. So at the very least, were he to become the president again, you're going to see a very chaotic foreign policy. And so the consequences for the rest of the world, I think, actually are going to be quite dire and should not be underestimated. My view is that this election is the most consequential election in American history since Abraham Lincoln was elected over the issue of ending slavery. And Abraham Lincoln was admired around the world. And in fact, the American example of the Civil War and defeating slavery spread around the world to other countries. And one could imagine what would be the example of another Trump administration. As a former ambassador to Finland, I remember when President Trump met President Putin in Helsinki. And he gave one of the most embarrassing presentations of any American president, which he said he believed Vladimir Putin, who sends out, assassins from his different organizations to kill people he thinks are traitors, is right. And he believes Putin instead of believing his own intelligence service and his own, I can tell you across the board, nonpartisan, both party experts in foreign policy said it was the most traitorous thing they had ever heard by an American president. So the consequences for the rest of the world, I think, were going to be quite dire, and no one should underestimate them.
Yes, you bring back a lot of memories, both of you, with these observations, not to mention the fascinating bromance with the North Korean leader, which was quite extraordinary. But yeah, so there we are. I was going to move on to trade, and I've got a question in our list here from Steve Jacoby, one of our great trade experts here in New Zealand, where Stephen asks, trade and China have both been flashpoints for US policy under President Trump and President Biden. the Biden administration has been more polite, but hasn't changed a lot in terms of policy. Can we expect much airtime given to these issues in the election? Now, our two friends have just made the point that international issues are not likely to be at the centre of the campaign, but nonetheless doesn't mean that positioning on trade and on China won't feature. So let's hear from both of you.
Well,
the
Bruce.
anti-Chinese sentiment among the American public is at an all-time high. It is higher than it was after Tiananmen Square. And so there's really nothing that either Harris or Trump can say about China that's bad, that the American people won't approve of. So I think that while you're likely to hear some bombast out of Trump about China, my guess is, other than Harris, when she's pushed, will say she's going to be tough on China because that plays well with all voters. You won't get much specifics out of her. And what you do get, I think, out of a Democratic administration or Democratic candidate is at least an acknowledgement that on certain issues we have to work with China, climate change being a perfect example. We cannot halt or slow or turn back climate change without cooperation with China. And since Trump and the people around him deny that climate change is taking place, it's just one avenue of cooperation with China, which they don't see any value in.
And one interesting aspect, Helen, of the campaign people might not know about is that Governor Walz, when he graduated from college, went and taught in China. He taught in a high school in southern China in Guangzhou province. And then when he became a teacher back in Minnesota, he brought students on field trips to China. And then as a member of Congress, he was very engaged with China issues. He was very outspoken about human rights in China, but he was also very firm that we had to engage with China because he had met regular Chinese people. And he knew, how smart and amazing and how interesting they are, even if the system doesn't always, allow them to develop in the way we think they should. So I think his advice, at least, is going to be nuanced about engagement with China. And he might turn out to be a kind of secret weapon for her, assuming that they would win. I think he might be positioned to play a larger role than a vice president traditionally does in foreign affairs, especially with regard to China. So I think people put that in their back pocket. But there's a very good article they can look up online in the New York Times that appeared today about his background in China, which surprised a lot of people.
Yes, this is very interesting to a New Zealand audience because, as in the US, the China relationship is of a lot of interest. Last week, Professor Hugh White visited New Zealand from Australian National University, and Hugh has a history of advising Australian Defence Minister Beazley and Prime Minister Hawke, and has been at, I think, Assistant Secretary level in the Australian Defence Department. And his positioning was that, as in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, when the US tended to treat the Soviet Union as an equal, because after all it had a lot of nuclear weapons, is it able to move to a position where it sees China as an equal and works out a role that's appropriate for the US and the Asia Pacific that doesn't rely on attempting to maintain primacy in the West Pacific? So these sort of thoughts and discussions are swirling around New Zealand, and we'll be very interested to see how this plays out with the US. I felt, looking back to the Obama administration, that Barack Obama was perhaps one of the first to get it, that being the unchallenged superpower for a long period of time, what probably wasn't sustainable. But that isn't the easiest thing to say to a population which has been used to its country having that status. I mean, would you have any observations to make about this general debate?
Well,
I
I'll
think,
just,
one of
go ahead, Bruce.
the issues will be that's beyond the control of either Trump or Harris is what China does around Taiwan.
Mhm.
And you know, President Biden a number of times said we would go to the defense of Taiwan.
Mhm.
The public opinion polls are pretty clear. Americans were willing to supply weapons to Taiwan. We weren't willing to send troops to defend Taiwan. In fact, a Defense Department official said to me when I showed him this data that someone should have showed the data to the president before he spoke out about what they would do. Uh, but China has agency here. It will do what it's going to do, and it would. Trump has, on occasion, suggested that he wouldn't defend Taiwan. And Harris hasn't really spoken out on it. As you say, the administration's position has been they would defend Taiwan. But I would presume, and certainly the Pentagon has said at times in public, they presume that at some point China will pressure Taiwan in a way that hasn't in the past, whether that's a blockade or an invasion or we don't know what. But that would be the real test of U.S. policy toward China, because we would either respond or we wouldn't respond, and if we didn't respond, many of our allies in the Western Pacific would question their alliance with the United States, unfortunately.
And
Derek,
one of
any
the
thoughts?
yes, well, one thing I've looked at is, were there to be a conflict, an actual military conflict between the United States and China over Taiwan, the economic consequences of that to the global economy, to America, and to China would be immense. And one of my little side projects I've been working on is just to calculate, in the trillions and trillions of dollars. And so obviously it would hurt the Chinese and the Chinese economy. And, one of the ways that the Communist Party maintains its support in China is by growing the economy. So I think that it's very useful to point out the consequences of that kind of conflict to avoid that conflict. And I agree with Bruce. I don't think that Trump people really understand how this could get out of control. That's one of my great fears about Trump. You mentioned North Korea, you mentioned China, Iran. One of the consequences of Trump coming to power is that he abrogated the treaty that we had with Iran, which had slowed their development of a nuclear weapon. And we don't have that in place right now. And that's added worry to what's happening in the Middle East if the war spreads. So there are a lot of danger points out there. I think that, I have a fair amount of faith. I know a lot of the people involved in the Biden administration who make foreign policy. I know many of Harris's advisors. I think they have very smart, competent people who are not going to go off hack-hopped or do anything crazy. But we also have to have some reciprocation from China. China under Chairman Xi, we all know, has gotten much more authoritarian at home. And it's not just a simple matter, and I think I disagree with you, White. I'm very familiar with his views a bit, on to just say, well, China deserves a leadership role, there needs to be treated as an equal. One of the things that the US doesn't get enough credit for is how much we reached out to include China in the global economy, starting when President Clinton gave them, ability to join the WTO. But for example, we sent over our experts from our aviation system to help them create a safe national aviation system. We sent over the experts from our banking system to advise them. We sent over economists. We did not try and keep China down. If anything, we tried to help China raise up and become a democratic, more economically successful country. So I don't quite agree that somehow we haven't given China enough respect. But on the other hand, I do think we have to continue to engage. And that's one of the interesting things about Governor Walz, is that he understands the nuance, that you can disagree with China, you cannot be happy with their human rights record, but yes, you engage with them.
Yeah, yeah. I think New Zealanders would relate to that. You mentioned, the demolition of the nuclear arrangement with Iraq, with Iran, but it's also, I guess, worth noting in this context that the nuclear weapons control architecture in Europe has also had a terrific battering, and that raises the issue of how the Ukraine war will play out, where you have now an angry Russia that's been invaded itself, reciprocation. We have a question here from David Mowring, which asks, will the EU step up if the US reduces support of Ukraine? Is this debate about support for Ukraine going to feature at all in the campaign? And actually, if I raise the elephant in the room, regardless of who is elected, is Ukraine likely to see more pressure to move towards some kind of settlement?
The support for aid to Ukraine among the American public continues to go down. And a majority of Republicans in these polls now say we give Ukraine too much money. So the U.S. Congress took 6 months basically to approve the most recent aid package for Ukraine. I think it is quite, I won't say unlikely, but it will be a very, very steep uphill climb to get a major aid package for Ukraine in the next Congress. And if the president is President Trump, I don't think we'll get one. I think that that, again, as you suggest, puts the onus on the Europeans to step up more. To their credit, they are giving Ukraine more money than we are, contrary to what candidate Trump says. He repeatedly falsely claims that we give more than they do. But they have their own politics. And while I think van der Leyen, who is the president of the European Commission, and the French are supportive of doing more, as are the Danes and some others. The German coalition is really, I think, about to break apart, certainly. And I don't know that they can step up more of the aid. So I think it's going to be very difficult for Europeans to make up the difference. And the pressure on Ukraine to settle will only increase if now if Harris is elected, I think the administration will try to stay the course. It really depends on the situation in Congress. But I don't necessarily have faith that the Democrats will maintain their support for Ukraine indefinitely. And what is even the definition of indefinitely? Is it 1 more year? Is it 2 more years? But I do think that we are, unfortunately for the Ukrainian people, coming to the end of Western support for Ukraine.
Let me say, we know that President Putin is not going to make any kind of agreement during the election because he's hoping Trump will win.
Yeah.
Trump's already said he'll sit down with Putin, they'll solve all this, and Trump will just give as much to Ukraine as possible away to the Russians. But assuming Harris wins, there'll be a new calculation for Putin, and we won't know exactly what that calculation is. We won't know if there are other pressures. This is where China's role, because China's been very important in providing economic aid to Russia to allow them to keep the war going. If we had a better or a more interesting relationship with China, there might be a three-way talk about a resolution to the war in Ukraine. We don't know. I think the possibilities of a negotiated settlement might exist if Harris wins. I think a much more dire consequence for Ukraine will be the consequence if Trump wins.
Mm. Mm. I suspect that's very much true. Just switching back to points that were made earlier, Helen Gator says, Bruce raises the changing US demographic, your very first answer, I think, Bruce. Some commentators have proposed that this has given rise to what they've coined as, quote, culture wars, which include, quote, class wars. As a consequence, this has led to a fracturing of the belief in, quote, we the people. How do you think this cultural vying for control of resources will play out in this election?
No, I couldn't agree with the questioner more. I think that James Carville, who was a very famous and very outspoken advisor to President Clinton, coined the phrase, it's the economy, stupid. And since we're all versed in economics, we all took at least one economics course in college. We believe, and we all read our Marx at one point, economy is everything. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think that the problems in the United States are not exclusively, but largely cultural. That includes some class stuff around economics, without a doubt. But it is part of this sense that there was a play in Broadway in the 1960s called Stop the World, I Want to Get Off. And I think there are a lot of Americans who feel that way. And if you look at various cultural issues, what is striking is the number of states that have banned abortion, or where there has been legislation against gay people, or it's been made harder to vote, which basically impacts minorities and to a disproportionate extent. It is states that voted for Trump, and many of them, often the majority of them, were in the Confederacy in the Civil War. And I think we have deeper divides culturally in the United States than we have had at least since the 1950s or 1960s. And some people would say it goes back to the 1850s.
But as Bruce mentioned earlier, all of the advancement, one might say, in terms of democratic rights and participation that have taken place in the US that led to dramatic changes in the role of women and in the role of people of color, which from one point of view could be part of viewing the realization of the democratic vision of America, that our statement that all men, and in fact women, are created equal, we're taking seriously now. But that has led to all these changes, and as Bruce said, they're cultural, not just economic. Some are economic, but it's a different vision of a country. It's not a country run solely by white people and by men. And to have to say that in the 21st century seems quite astounding, but there is still this reaction to all of that very rapid change. I mean, I just know, and so does Bruce, in our own lifetime, how quickly things have changed now that gay marriage is legal and our gay friends get married. When we were growing up, it was illegal to be homosexual, and they were put into, jail for it. Our wives couldn't get credit cards in their own name. They had to use their husband's name. We didn't have women's sports leagues, until we had Title IX. We didn't have all of these Black actors, comedians, sports teams. The entire American national basketball team at the Olympics were African American. The star of gymnastics, Simone Biles, African American. Some would say that's the realization of American democratic ideal, but other people are uneasy with it. And it's, I would say, somewhat fearful about it. And if they're also in states that have suffered relatively because of globalization, and I think Bruce would agree with me that the Democratic Party embraced globalization without nuance and didn't really think about the consequences for some of the people who didn't do well. And so if you're white and didn't do well, you sometimes say, well, all these other people are getting ahead of me. They're in line. They're getting, an extra service because they are a person of color. That's not fair. I don't like the changing role of women, or I don't think gays should be able to be married. And so in many ways, this campaign is an argument about what kind of country we want to have and whether it's even possible, which I don't think it is, to go back to some mythical happy 1950s version of America, because it wasn't very happy for a lot of people.
Well, that leads us naturally, I think, to a last question from Atagai Donna Burr, who says, the US has never elected a woman as president. The current momentum is looking very promising for this to change this election, particularly given the optics and stark differences between the two candidates. I would be interested to hear your thoughts on how much being a woman and a woman of colour could play a role among voters, or if this will have less of an impact compared to the age difference between the two and the perceived, quote, capability to do the job.
Well, it's a very big deal. We've never had a woman president. And we know that many people voted against Mrs. Clinton because she was a woman. So now we had this sort of added factor. We have a woman who's also a woman of color. But I think that makes the election, in a sense, even closer than it might otherwise be. That's an added factor. But I think, and Bruce had made this point, a lot will depend on how she campaigns in the next 3 months. She's going to be debating Donald Trump on September 10th. You should all tune in and watch that debate and see how she does. If she can maintain keeping her balance and her joyous approach and not make a big unforced error, I think we have a good chance, or at least a 50-50 chance of electing our first president who's a woman. But it's not inevitable, and it's going to be difficult.
No, I couldn't agree with Derek more. I think that we assumed we would break that glass ceiling in 2016. We did not. So the voters can surprise us all, including the pollsters. But right now she stands a very good chance of succeeding. But again, so many things in her control and so many things outside of her control could change that. And not the least of which would be if Donald Trump has a meltdown between now and Election Day.
Well, I would also add, don't discount the Taylor Swift factor.
Yes.
Because we know which side she's on, so we'll see what she does.
She shifts GDP results, so why not the American election?
Right.
Well, look, the two of you have just provided so many refreshing and fascinating insights, and we're really in your debt for taking the time to speak to the New Zealand audience on the campaign. We're following closely. We can't vote. but we know we're impacted one way or another what happens. So thank you so much for sharing your profound knowledge of what's going on right now in the US. I'm going to hand back to Murray to wrap up.
Thanks, Helen. That's the conclusion of today's webinar. Thank you very much to Ambassador Derek Shearer and Bruce Stokes for joining us today from the US, and to Helen for facilitating, and special thanks to you, our viewers, for tuning in today. A reminder that if you're not a member of our foundation, please do consider signing up at helenclark.foundation. We look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar, and until next time, noho ora mai, mate wā. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you,
Thank
Helen.
you all.
Thank you,
Thank
Murray.
you.